My parents gave my sister $400,000 as a wedding gift, and while it stung a bit, I was genuinely happy for her. They even agreed to cover the expenses of my wedding, which felt like a big gesture on their part. But 2 days after the wedding, I was hit with an invoice for everything they had paid. I didn't hesitate to send them a check along with a letter, and now they're in shock. I've never had the best relationship with my parents, though it wasn't terrible either. They've always been more partial toward my sister, Sarah, but I learned to deal with it. Sarah, now 32, has always been the golden child, and at 28, I was used to living in her shadow. Growing up, she got the newest phones, the best clothes, and more attention, while I made do with hand-me-downs and worked part-time jobs starting at 16 to afford the things I wanted. I didn't complain. I understood that my parents weren't obligated to provide more than the basics. Plus, I took pride in being independent. The real shock came when Sarah got married 3 years ago. My parents gave her and her husband an astonishing $400,000 as a wedding gift, which they used to buy a beautiful house in a fancy neighborhood. At the time, I was genuinely happy for her, even though it stung a little. I was busy with my own life, doing well as a software engineer, having saved up a decent amount, and dating Tom, who would later become my husband. I figured my time would come, and I didn't dwell on the fact that my parents had never given me anything near what they had given Sarah. After all, I didn't expect it. Fast forward to last year when Tom proposed. I was ecstatic. We had been together for years, and he was everything I had hoped for in a partner. We planned a modest wedding, nothing too extravagant, because we wanted to save for our future. Neither of us wanted to blow our savings on one day, even though it was important. We had budgeted around $36,000, which felt reasonable for the kind of wedding we envisioned, elegant but not over the top. To my surprise, my parents offered to pay for the entire wedding. I was touched. For once, it seemed like they were recognizing me as equally important. They were enthusiastic about helping, asking about venues and vendors, and they genuinely seemed to care about being involved in the planning. I didn't think much about the amount. I assumed they had already done so much for Sarah, so perhaps they wanted to do something special for me as well. I never expected them to contribute as much as they did for Sarah, but their offer to cover the wedding felt generous. The wedding itself was perfect. We had a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends, exactly what we wanted. My parents gave speeches, danced with us, and seemed genuinely happy. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally being treated equally, as if they were proud of me. The following week, Tom and I were preparing to leave for our honeymoon, but we had a few work commitments to finish first. Then, 2 days after the wedding, I received an email from my father. It wasn't a sweet message or a leftover wedding gift card like I had imagined. Instead, it was an itemized invoice attached as a PDF, listing every expense they had covered for the wedding. The email was short and impersonal. Please settle this at your earliest convenience. Your mother and I expect prompt payment. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The invoice totaled $35,438.89, down to the last flower arrangement and appetizer. It felt like a punch to the stomach. Tom found me frozen, and when I showed him the email, he was furious. It wasn't about the money. We could afford it if we had to, but that wasn't the point. My parents had volunteered to pay for the wedding. I hadn't asked them for a thing. They had come to me with the offer, seeming excited to be part of the planning process. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the years of feeling second to Sarah. When she got married, they gave her $400,000 with no strings attached. They never asked her to pay it back. Yet here they were, essentially billing me for my wedding, treating it like a loan. It felt like all the emotional baggage from years of favoritism had finally come to a head in this one cruel act. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent talking it over with Tom, I made a decision. I wrote them a check for the full amount, but I also included a letter. I didn't want to confront them directly because I knew I wouldn't be able to control my emotions, and I didn't want this to escalate into a shouting match. In the letter, I explained how deeply hurt I was. I reminded them that I had been independent since I was 16, paying my own way while watching them lavish everything on Sarah. I wrote that when they offered to pay for the wedding, I had naively believed they were finally treating me with the same love and care they had always shown her. Instead, I had been blindsided. I didn't hold back. I told them that I had let a lot slide over the years, never saying a word about how differently they treated Sarah and me. But this cruel bait and switch was something I couldn't accept. They had made me believe they were giving me a gift, only to turn around and demand repayment, as though I were a stranger, not their daughter. I also told them that this would be the last time we had any financial interactions. From that point forward, I would refuse any offers of help, support, or gifts from them, and I made it clear that I wanted nothing from them in the future, not even an inheritance. I told them they could give it all to Sarah, just like they had done with everything else. I sent the check and the letter by mail, then blocked their numbers. I needed space. Tom supported my decision, and I felt a sense of relief after sending everything off. But then they went completely silent. I heard nothing from them, and the silence only made me angrier. Then the messages from extended family started flooding in. Distant aunts, uncles, and family friends began calling and texting, accusing me of being ungrateful and overly dramatic. They said my parents had done so much for me and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. Even Sarah called, screaming at me for tearing the family apart. She insisted I should have just paid the invoice without making any noise. It was the same old Sarah, always defending them, and why wouldn't she? I haven't responded to any of them because I honestly don't know what to say. On one hand, I feel completely justified in my actions. After years of feeling like the second choice, this felt like the final straw, and I needed to stand up for myself. But on the other hand, I keep questioning myself. Am I being too sensitive? Was it unreasonable to expect that they would treat my wedding as a gift like they did with Sarah's? Should I have just paid the invoice and moved on? Tom's family has been incredibly supportive through all of this. His parents were horrified when they heard what my parents had done, and they've been checking in with us every day. But the constant messages from my side of the family are starting to wear me down. Now, I'm questioning whether I made the right decision. Did I handle this the wrong way? Should I have tried to talk to my parents before cutting them off? Or was I right to finally draw the line after feeling like I was never as valued as Sarah? Now I'm truly stuck, and I'm not sure if I'm the one in the wrong. Part of me feels like I had every right to be upset and stand up for myself, but another part of me wonders if I've just caused an irreparable rift in my family. Maybe I should have handled things differently. Do you guys have any insights? Update 1. Since my last post, things have taken a turn for the worse. I had no idea that simply sending that check and letter would trigger such a chain of events. But here we are. Yesterday morning, I woke up to an email from my mother. It slipped through because she used her work email, which I hadn't blocked yet. The email was long and self-righteous. In it, she explained that the invoice they had sent wasn't meant to be taken seriously. According to her, they never actually planned to cash the check. The whole thing, she said, was a life lesson about financial responsibility. They wanted to test my reaction, and once they felt I had learned my lesson, they were planning to tear up the check and surprise me with a $100,000 wedding gift instead. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A life lesson? What kind of parents play tricks like that on their adult daughter? After reading that, it became even more obvious that it wasn't about love or fairness. It was about control. They wanted to see if I would resist or just blindly comply. It felt manipulative and cruel. Without a second thought, I mobile deposited the check. There was no way I was letting them tear it up after that so-called lesson. I wanted that check cashed, and I wanted them to feel the full weight of their actions. In response to my mother's email, I sent a short and straightforward reply. Thank you for confirming that this was indeed a deliberate test, rather than a misunderstanding. After sending it, I blocked her work email as well. I knew there would likely be more attempts to contact me, but I wasn't interested in playing any more games or enduring more so-called lessons. Later that evening, things took a turn. Sarah showed up at my apartment unannounced. She started banging on my door, shouting my name. I didn't answer right away, hoping she'd eventually give up and leave, but that wasn't the case. Instead, she started yelling through the door, accusing me of being childish and making a bigger deal out of this than necessary. She said our parents were just trying to teach me responsibility because they were concerned about my spending habits. That comment, coming from Sarah, of all people, made my blood boil. This was the same woman who had never once paid her own phone bill, never worked without my parents' support, and now she had the nerve to lecture me about financial responsibility? As she continued ranting, I quietly started recording everything on my phone. I wasn't sure how things were going to play out, but I wanted to have proof if this escalated into something even messier. Sarah went on and on about how I was tearing the family apart over something trivial, urging me to apologize to our parents and move on. She insisted that they never meant to hurt me and that they had always done their best for both of us. She kept saying I was overreacting and that the entire situation was my fault. I didn't say a word. I didn't open the door. I just sat there, listening in silence. Eventually, after what felt like hours, she left, but not before calling me selfish and accusing me of trying to cut ties with the family over money. Once she was gone, I sat in silence for a while, feeling the weight of everything. Sarah's outburst only confirmed what I had known for years. She would always defend our parents, no matter how unreasonable or hurtful their actions were. That night, I received even more messages from extended family members. It seemed that after her failed attempt to talk to me, Sarah had gone straight to my parents, and now they were rallying the family. My phone was bombarded with texts from aunts, uncles, and even a few family friends. Most of the messages followed the same pattern, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of causing unnecessary drama, and urging me to apologize to my parents for how I had treated them. One message stood out to me more than the others. It was from an aunt I hadn't heard from in years. She told me that I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to teach me these lessons, and that I should be grateful they were willing to spend so much on my wedding. She ended the message by saying I was lucky to have parents who even wanted to be involved in my life at all. I couldn't believe how quickly everyone had turned on me. It felt as if they had all decided my parents were in the right simply because they were the ones with the money and influence. No one seemed to care about the emotional manipulation or the years of favoritism that had led up to this moment. All they saw was that I was rejecting my parents' so-called generosity, and that was enough for them to side against me. By this point, Tom was getting really concerned about how much this was affecting me. He kept asking if I wanted to take a break from social media and turn off my phone for a while, just to get some peace of mind. He tried to reassure me, reminding me that I wasn't in the wrong, and pointed out all the times my parents had shown favoritism towards Sarah, using money as a tool to control both of us. The most frustrating part was that I couldn't get any real answers. My parents weren't reaching out to explain themselves further. They truly believed in their own version of events, portraying themselves as the misunderstood parents who were just trying to help, while I was the ungrateful daughter who had blown everything out of proportion. I started to wonder if I should have handled things differently. Maybe I should have sat down with them for a real conversation instead of sending that letter and blocking them. But then again, I knew how those conversations usually went. They would twist everything around until I ended up apologizing for feeling hurt in the first place. It was a cycle I'd been stuck in for years, and I wasn't sure if I had the energy to go through it all again. Update 2. For now, I'm trying to focus on the life Tom and I are building together. We can't do much except hope for things to get better in time. Update 2. Hey everyone, I wanted to start by thanking all of you for your responses. Reading through your comments, advice, and personal stories really helped me process everything that's been happening. It's been a whirlwind of emotions over the past few days, and your support has meant more than you could imagine. While I've tried to stay strong through all of this, things took yet another unexpected turn. A few days after Sarah's visit, I received a call from my father's brother, my uncle. I hadn't spoken to him in years, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect. He's never been particularly close to the family, so I thought maybe he was reaching out to tell me to make amends with my parents, just like everyone else had. But instead, what he told me shocked me and gave me a perspective I hadn't considered before. He began by telling me he had heard what was happening through the family grapevine, and he felt compelled to reach out because, apparently, this wasn't the first time my parents had pulled a stunt like this. 20 years ago, something similar happened between him and my grandparents, my father's parents. My uncle had refused to go along with their manipulative tactics, and as a result, they smeared his name throughout the family, accusing him of trying to steal from them and being ungrateful for everything they had done. He explained that back then, my dad didn't support him. In fact, he sided with their parents, leading to a huge rift between the two brothers that had never fully healed. My uncle told me that he had always felt abandoned by my dad, and it took him years to come to terms with the way their family operated. Listening to him speak about the past felt eerily familiar, like hearing my own story but with different people. My grandparents had used money and manipulation to control my uncle, just as my parents were trying to do with me now. The more he spoke, the more it all began to make sense. My parents weren't just acting out of character. They were repeating a pattern that had been set long before I was even born. They had learned this behavior from their own parents, and my dad, having been complicit in his brother's situation years ago, was now playing the same role I had found myself in. My uncle also shared that his refusal to comply with my grandparents' demands came with severe consequences. After the falling out, my grandparents cut him off completely, both financially and emotionally. They painted him as the black sheep of the family, and to this day, there are relatives who still believe the lies my grandparents spread about him. It was all about control, he said. When they couldn't control me anymore, they erased me from their lives. Hearing my uncle's story gave me chills. It was like a reflection of what was happening to me now. My parents were upset because I had refused to go along with their game, and instead of trying to understand my side, they turned the entire family against me. I began to see how deeply this toxic cycle ran and how ingrained my parents were in the belief that they could control their children through manipulation. After my conversation with my uncle, I couldn't stop thinking about everything he had said. It made me wonder if, deep down, my father's behavior was driven by guilt. Maybe he knew he had abandoned his brother all those years ago and was now trying to justify his actions by doubling down on the same tactics. My parents had built their entire relationship with Sarah and me around the idea that we owed them something, and any deviation from that script was seen as betrayal. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't about me at all. It was about them, about their unresolved issues and the unhealthy dynamics they had learned from their own parents. In the days that followed, I continued to receive more messages from family members. It was clear that Sarah had been working overtime to rally people against me. One of my cousins, whom I had always been close to, sent me a long text accusing me of being selfish and disrespectful for not appreciating everything my parents had done for me. She told me that it wasn't too late to fix things, but I needed to humble myself and apologize before it was too late. Her message echoed the same rhetoric everyone else had been using, and it was exhausting to read. I began to realize that I had been raised in a family where love was conditional. Everything came with strings attached, whether it was financial support, emotional care, or even something as simple as celebrating a major life event like a wedding. Now, because I had refused to follow their rules, I was being cut off and isolated, just like my uncle had been years ago. Tom has been my unwavering support through all of this. After my uncle's call, we sat down and had a long talk about the future. He reminded me that no matter what happens, we will get through this together, and that I don't owe anyone anything. Not my parents, not Sarah, and certainly not the extended family members who had suddenly taken up the role of armchair psychologists. His support has been constant, and I'm beyond grateful for it. But even with Tom by my side, I still feel conflicted. My parents had done a number on me emotionally, and part of me still wondered if I was in the wrong. Was there a way to fix things without compromising my boundaries? I spent hours turning it over in my mind, trying to figure out if there was a path to reconciliation that wouldn't come at the cost of my mental health. Then something strange happened. I received a voicemail from my dad. It was the first time he had reached out directly since I sent the letter and check. His voice sounded different, not angry or demanding like I had expected, but tired. In the message, he said he didn't want to fight anymore and that he was willing to talk if I was open to it. He didn't apologize or acknowledge what had happened, but there was something in his tone that made it clear something had shifted. Maybe he was starting to realize I wasn't going to back down this time. I haven't responded yet. Part of me wants to call him back and see if there's a chance for an honest conversation, but another part of me knows this could just be another attempt to manipulate me into feeling guilty. My uncle's words keep ringing in my mind. They'll never admit they're wrong because they don't think they are. If I do decide to talk to my dad, I need to be ready for the possibility that nothing will change. Right now, I'm still processing everything. The revelations from my uncle, the messages from family, my dad's voicemail. It's all swirling around in my head, and I'm not sure what my next step will be. I want to believe that my parents can change, that they can finally see me as an equal and not just someone they can control. But I also know that after years of being treated this way, it's going to take more than a single conversation to repair the damage. For now, I'm taking things one day at a time. Tom and I have been focusing on building our lives and our future together, trying to create something healthy and free from the toxic patterns of our families. But the doubt still lingers. Am I doing the right thing by standing my ground? Or am I pushing away the only family I've ever known? As much as I want a clear answer, I'm still in the same position, and maybe that's okay. I'll keep you all updated as things progress, but for now, I'm just trying to navigate this as best as I can. Update 3. Hi everyone. I want to start by saying how incredibly grateful I am for all your responses. Your advice and support have been invaluable as I try to make sense of this mess with my family. When I first posted, I wasn't sure where things were headed or what I should do. But after reading your comments and reflecting on everything, I've come to some important realizations. One thing that really stood out from your responses was how many of you pointed out that, for so long, I've been forcing myself to make things right with my mom and dad, trying to patch things up and pretend like everything was normal. The truth is, I finally accepted that it's okay if things don't go back to normal because, honestly, I'm not even sure what normal was. The dynamic with my parents has always been unhealthy, and I've spent years trying to ignore that. Now, I realize it's okay to let go of the idea that things will ever be the way I wanted them to be. Many of you also pointed out that I may have been too forgiving in assuming my dad's behavior was driven by guilt. Looking back, I see that I was clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could change. You're right. His guilt doesn't justify his actions, and it doesn't excuse the years of manipulation, favoritism, and emotional control. No matter how guilty he might feel, it doesn't erase the harm that's been done, and it doesn't mean I have to let him off the hook for it. But at the same time, I realize that I do need closure. I need to put an end to this chapter of my life, whether or not it leads to reconciliation with my parents. So, I decided to meet with my dad. I felt like it was something I had to do for my own peace of mind, not for them. When I met with my dad, I could immediately tell he wasn't the same person I had grown up fearing. He seemed worn down, almost defeated, and for the first time in my life, he actually seemed apologetic. He didn't say, "I'm sorry," in those exact words, but he acknowledged how things had gone with the wedding and how both my mom and Sarah had treated me. He even mentioned that he had spoken to some of our relatives and asked them to stop bothering me, which was a small relief. But then he did something that caught me completely off guard. He tried to return the money. He pulled out the same check I had sent him for the wedding expenses and slid it across the table towards me, asking me to take it back.